Welcome to Deep Dive. For this episode, we dive into the Nag Hammadi text. This was mentioned to me by Seeker in episode 194. We have 3 sources for this deep dive, which you will see on screen.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take some really fascinating source material and basically pull out the key insights for you, our listener.
Exactly. Save you from getting swamped by too much information.
Right. Think of us as your fast track to understanding, hopefully with a few of those, aha moments thrown in.
And today, we are really diving deep into the world of the Nag Hammadi library texts. Ancient, sometimes pretty enigmatic stuff.
Definitely. We're doing this for you, the learner. You're curious, you value your time, you want to get right to the point.
So we're exploring this collection of writings found back in 1945. The first big English translation really hit the shelves in 1977.
1977. And that was around the time scholars also got access to actual copies, the facsimiles.
Precisely, which opened the door for a much wider study of these, they're often called Gnostic scriptures.
Gnostic scriptures, it sounds so mysterious, doesn't it?
It really does.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. Let's try to unpack some of the core ideas, understand the historical context a bit better for these really captivating, sometimes, puzzling texts.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's start simple. What is the Nag Hammadi library like, physically?
Right. So in essence, it's a collection. 13 Coptic codices.
Codices.
Yeah, think of them like early books, bound pages of papyrus, discovered in Egypt.
Okay.
And like you said, 1977 was key. That's when the first major one-volume English translation came out. E.J. Brill and Harper and Row were the publishers.
Right, I remember you mentioning that. But that wasn't the end of the story, translation-wise.
Not at all. That 1977 publication sort of coincided with the launch of an even bigger project, the Coptic Gnostic Library, also under the Brill imprint.
So like a much more detailed version.
Exactly. It's this ongoing, super in-depth scholarly edition. It includes not just the Nag Hammadi texts, but also 3 similar manuscripts from collections in Berlin, London, and Oxford. Yeah, each volume gives you the Coptic text meticulously edited, fresh English translations, really detailed introductions, notes, indices, the works.
It looks like a massive undertaking.
Oh, it is. It's involved tons of scholars over decades. Really shows how important these texts are considered, academically.
Absolutely. Now, when they actually found this collection, were there any weird things about it, quirks?
Definitely. It's actually quite interesting. There's some repetition.
Repetition.
Yeah. For instance, the writings, the tractates in Codex 3, they're also found in Codex 3.
Huh. So Codex 4th is kind of extra?
Sort of superfluous, yeah,
Yeah.
in a way. And even more telling, we have 3 separate copies of one text, the Apocryphon of John.
3 copies of the same thing.
One in Codex 2, one in Codex 3, and another in Codex 3.
Okay. Why would that happen? Any theories?
Well, it strongly suggests, that the libraries we have it might actually be a compilation.
Like someone gathered smaller collections together.
Exactly. Maybe an individual, maybe a community, bundled together scrolls or codices they had access to, like making a personal anthology.
An ancient spiritual mixtape. I like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, what about dating? When were these things actually written down? Always feels like detective work with ancient texts.
It really is. And dating Coptic literary handwriting, it's, let's just say it's less precise than dating Greek manuscripts from the same era, or even everyday Coptic cursive.
So it's harder to pin down.
Yeah. There hasn't been a truly comprehensive paleographical study of all the Nag Hammadi hands, but the general consensus puts them somewhere between the early and late 4th century CE.
4th century. So still quite a range. Why is it so tough?
Well, most of the texts just don't give us clues. No internal dates, no clear references to historical events we can pinpoint. They're kind of floating in their own theological space.
Right, self-contained.
Mostly.
Yeah.
But there is one potential clue, a text called The Concept of Our Great Power. It mentions a group called the Anamadians. They were considered heretical, and they were quite active in Alexandria in the late 350 CE.
When Athanasius was hiding out.
Exactly, during one of his periods in hiding from theological enemies. So that reference suggests that particular text, at least its final version, probably wasn't written before the late 350s.
Okay, so that gives us a little anchor, at least for one text.
A small one, yeah.
All right, let's shift gears then. Away from the physical books and the dating, what about the ideas inside these texts? What are the big themes that jump out? What would have felt, I don't know, revolutionary back then?
Oh, definitely. One of the most striking themes, you see it again and again, is this intense focus on self-knowledge. Knowing yourself as the path to understanding the divine, the kingdom.
Self-knowledge.
Yeah, the Gospel of Thomas is full of this. Saying 3, for instance, says the kingdom is inside you and outside you.
Inside and outside.
Right. And then saying 33 says, basically, when you really know yourselves, you'll realize you're children of the living Father, and you'll become known.
So the key isn't some external authority, it's looking inward.
Pretty much. That's the radical idea for you, the learner. The divine connection is within you, not necessarily mediated by priests or temples in the way people might have expected. It kind of flips the script.
That's powerful.
It is. And another saying from Thomas, saying 111 hammers it home, whoever finds himself is superior to the world.
Wow. Superior to the world? Just by knowing yourself?
Seems to be the implication, yeah. That self-awareness holds immense power in their view.
Okay, so self-knowledge is huge. What else? What other big ideas kept cropping up?
Another major one is about the nature of reality itself. There's often this contrast drawn between a higher, true, imperishable reality
Okay.
and this lower material world we experience, which is seen as perishable, maybe even illusory to some extent.
So our everyday reality isn't the real reality.
That's often the vibe, yeah. It's not always laid out like a neat philosophical system, but it's strongly implied. The paraphrase of Shem, for example, says something like, what comes from the perishable is perishable, but what comes from imperishableness lasts forever.
Makes sense. So the material world is temporary, flawed.
And often, linked to that, the physical body is viewed with, well, suspicion maybe. Or at least as something to be careful about, something to transcend.
Like the body is a problem.
Sometimes. Saying 112 in the Gospel of Thomas has Jesus saying, woe to the flesh that depends on the soul. Woe to the soul that depends on the flesh. There's a tension there.
A tension, right?
And the book of Thomas the Contender, it really pushes for detachment from bodily desires.
Interesting. That's quite different from, say, celebrating the goodness of physical creation.
It is.
Yeah.
And that leads us naturally into their cosmology, their ideas about how the universe, how everything came to be.
Okay. Creation stories. Always fascinating.
Very. Many texts talk about a divine realm, the pleroma. Think of it as the fullness, the radiant totality of the divine.
The pleroma.
And it's populated by these spiritual beings called eons, almost like aspects or emanations of the ultimate God.
Like a divine family tree, almost.
You could kind of think of it that way, a fullness of divine powers. And within this, a figure named Sophia, often linked with wisdom, plays a really key role in creation.
Sophia. Wisdom.
But sometimes her role is problematic. In some stories, like in the hypostasis of the archons, she acts sort of independently, maybe rashly, and ends up producing something imperfect.
Imperfect creation. From a divine being.
Yeah. And this imperfection leads to the emergence of these lesser powers, the archons.
Archons. Okay.
And their leader often is a figure named Yaldabaoth.
Yaldabaoth, got it.
He does something pretty bold. He declares he was the only god.
Whoa. Wait, he thinks he's the top guy.
Exactly. The text even lists some of his buddies, other powers that arise with him: Athoth, Iluwayo, Astrophio, Yao, Sabaoth, Adonane, Sabbation. It's his whole lower hierarchy.
The whole bureaucracy of lesser gods.
Kind of. And a key thing, they're often portrayed as jealous of humanity. The hypostasis of the archons mentions this specifically.
Jealous. Why?
Maybe because humanity retains a spark of the higher divinity that they lack, or that Sophia put into Adam. So Yaldabaoth is like this flawed creator, a demiurge, who doesn't realize there's something higher than him.
Right, the demiurge idea. So that explains the flaws in the world, perhaps.
That's a big part of it, yes. It introduces cosmic conflict. And tied into all this is the idea of a fall, some kind of separation from that original divine source. That theme echoes through many of the texts in different ways.
Okay, so if there's a fall, presumably there's a way back. What about salvation? Redemption?
Good question. Generally, salvation in these texts is framed as a journey of knowledge, gnosis.
Gnosis, knowledge.
Right. It's about acquiring that special knowledge and achieving a spiritual ascent, getting back to that higher reality.
And is there a guide, a
Yeah.
savior figure?
Often, yes. A savior figure, frequently identified with Jesus, is central. He's the one who reveals the truth, the gnosis, that offers the path to redemption.
So Jesus is a revealer of secret knowledge.
In many of these texts, that's a primary role. The Apocalypse of Peter, for instance, talks about an incorruptible one, who helps the soul escape evil.
So it's less about faith in the way we might think of it and more about understanding and awakening.
Precisely. Knowledge is key. It's transformative. Even familiar practices like baptism are sometimes viewed differently. Texts like On Baptism A or the Paraphrase of Shem discuss it, but maybe not with the same sacramental weight as in later mainstream Christianity.
And resurrection.
Also often different. It's usually not pictured as just, bringing a corpse back to life. The treatise on resurrection talks about it more as a transformation, becoming new, imperishable, something that descends upon the perishable parts of us.
A spiritual change, not just physical resuscitation.
That seems to be the emphasis in many cases, yeah.
Fascinating. What else? Did they have unique ideas about, say, human nature itself?
They did. One text, the Tripartite Tractate, lays out this really interesting idea. Humanity is divided into 3 types, or races:
3 types.
spiritual, psychic, and material, or helic.
Spiritual, psychic, material.
Okay.
And they have different fates.
According to this text, yes, the spiritual race, destined for complete salvation, reunion with the divine. The material race, they're headed for destruction, bound to the lower world.
And the psychic, the middle group.
They're in the middle. They have potential for good or evil. Their path is more nuanced depending on their choices and allegiances.
Wow, that's quite a categorization, divvying up humanity like that.
It's a very particular view, yeah. And it ties back into that theme of conflict we mentioned earlier.
Right, the conflict seems pretty central.
Absolutely, it's everywhere. Higher versus lower realms, light versus darkness, the archons being jealous of humans.
Yeah.
Even within the divine realm itself, there can be tension. The Tripartite Tractate talks about the Logos needing illumination. The Valentinian exposition mentions the struggle between the right and the left within the divine structure.
So, not just one big, happy divine family up there either.
Apparently not always. It's often portrayed as more dynamic, more complex.
We touched on the body being viewed cautiously. Did this translate into, lifestyle recommendations? Asceticism?
Yes, definitely. Ascetic teachings pop up, especially strongly in texts like the Book of Thomas the Contender.
What kind of teachings?
Urging renunciation of bodily passions. These passions are often described as a fire that burns the soul, distracts you from spiritual things.
A fire. Okay.
And the Gospel of Thomas has that saying, number 110, whoever finds the world and becomes rich, let him renounce the world. So detachment from materialism, worldly concerns.
Right. That seems like a consistent thread, getting beyond the material.
Very much so.
What about women? We hear a lot about how women were viewed in early Christianity. How do they feature in these Nag Hammadi texts?
That's actually one of the really striking aspects. Women often play significant, even central roles.
Like who?
Well, Mary Magdalene is very prominent in the Gospel of Mary. She's portrayed as a favored disciple who receives special revelations, and she even has this tense exchange with Peter, who seems skeptical of her authority.
Mary Magdalene debating Peter. That's interesting.
It is. And then there's Sophia, wisdom, who we already talked about. She's absolutely crucial in many of the cosmological narratives.
Right, the creator figure, sometimes flawed.
Exactly. And beyond that, some texts, particularly Sethian ones, even talk about a divine triad, Father, Mother, and Son. Figures like Noria are mentioned in this kind of context.
Father, mother, and son.
Yes. So it's clear that in many of these traditions, female figures and the feminine principle weren't just secondary. They could hold really important positions in the divine structure and in the community's understanding.
That's a very different picture than we often get.
It really is.
Okay, one last big area. What about the ultimate God, the highest power? How did they conceive of that, especially if you have figures like Yaldabaoth claiming to be God?
Good point. Many of these texts clearly distinguish between the lower creator God, the demiurge like Yaldabaoth, and a higher ultimate God.
A God beyond the creator.
Yes. Often described as unknowable, ineffable, beyond comprehension. Sometimes terms like forefather are used, as in eugnostos, maybe to differentiate this ultimate source from the more active but flawed creator of our specific cosmos.
Forefather. That's subtle.
It is. And as we just mentioned, some Sethian texts posit that divine triad, Father, Mother, Son, pointing towards a complex understanding of the ultimate divine reality, not just a single male figure.
So the God behind the God, in a sense.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. A reality beyond the immediate creator of the flawed material world.
Okay, this is incredibly rich and diverse. Now, you mentioned the term Gnostic earlier. Were these groups all calling themselves that? Was there any sense of unity or maybe even disagreement within the library?
That's a crucial point. No, Gnostic wasn't really a term most of these groups use for themselves. It's more of a label applied later, often by opponents, and scholars use it somewhat broadly today.
So it's an outsider label, mostly.
Largely, yes. And what's really fascinating is that you find criticism within the Nag Hammadi collection itself.
Really? Like what?
The Testimony of Truth, for instance, actually attacks figures it calls Gnostic heresiarchs.
Wow. So even among the people who produced these texts, there were arguments about who was doing it right.
Absolutely. It shows this wasn't some single unified Gnostic church or movement. It was a much more varied landscape of ideas and communities, likely separated by time and geography, who sometimes disagreed quite strongly with each other.
A landscape of different spiritual experiments, maybe.
That's a good way to put it. And of course, eventually these kinds of views were largely excluded from what became Orthodox Christianity. The label Gnosticism itself became synonymous with heresy for the mainstream church.
Right. Okay, so bringing this all together for our listener, we've covered a lot of ground. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive into Nag Hammadi?
I think the biggest thing for you, the learner, is just the sheer diversity here.
Hmm.
This isn't one single system. It's a collection reflecting a whole range of fascinating spiritual and philosophical ideas from that period.
But definitely not monolithic.
Not at all.
Right.
Key themes we saw were that deep emphasis on self-knowledge gnosis as the path to the divine, the idea of a higher true reality versus this lower material one, complex stories about creation, the pleroma, eons, Sophia, the demiurge.
The whole cosmic drama.
Exactly. And salvation often being about achieving that knowledge, that spiritual transformation, maybe guided by a revealer figure. Plus, those unique takes on human nature, the three races, and the significant roles for women.
It's a glimpse into a very different way of seeing the world back then.
It truly is. It's not just history. It's a window into radically different spiritual possibilities that were being explored.
Absolutely. A potent reminder that religious thought in antiquity was incredibly varied. So, for you, our listener, here's something to chew on. Reflecting on these ancient ideas about self, reality, the divine, what pieces, if any, resonate with how you see the world today?
Or maybe, how does understanding this kind of diversity from the past change how we think about knowledge, belief, and truth in our own time?
Good questions. Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time exploring another fascinating subject.